Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel and happy Halloween. Today's video was one I was really interested in doing. I was really interested in researching it, and I'm so excited to share it with you. Just like our first video of Halloween, this story comes out of New Orleans. And when I think about New Orleans, I think about vampires, and that's not just because I was a die-hard Anne Rice fan growing up. Vampire lore has lived for hundreds of years in the city, especially in the French Quarter, the oldest area of New Orleans. A 2017 study done by Louisiana State University doctoral candidate John Edgar Browning said that at least 50 real vampires walk the streets of New Orleans. He claimed that although vampires have a reputation for blood-sucking and mayhem, they are pretty much just regular folk. The city even has its very own New Orleans Vampire Association. These are people who claim they have a medical condition which requires them to drink blood, human or animal, in order to sustain themselves. What about New Orleans attracts the mythical and real vampires of the world? It could have something to do with the fact that New Orleans is one of the most unique places in the United States, if not the world. New Orleans will give you the feeling of walking down the street of an old world European town. Having passed through so many hands, the city showcases the influences of these many cultures in its food, music, and architecture. So when I visited New Orleans this past June to attend CrimeCon, I of course had to take a vampire tour. It was a great tour. Our guide was an excellent storyteller. But I didn't find myself legitimately creeped out until the last stop. We found ourselves standing in front of an expansive, neoclassic French colonial-style building, the Ursuline Convent, located at 1100 Chartres Street. And the tour guide began to tell a tale that left goosebumps on my arms, despite the incredibly humid summer evening. Here is the legend of the Casket girls, and the belief that has existed in New Orleans for over 200 years about their vampiric connections. So let's go back into time, when New Orleans was a city in its infancy. The city was filled with men, mostly, soldiers and builders, and these men had been causing some problems by chasing around the native women. The founders of the city realized they needed to do something. They needed to bring good French women to the city so that they could marry these men and mellow them out a bit. They needed these women to marry these men, have babies, and start families, because you can't build the population of a city with only men. So they asked France for young women of childbearing age, and France sent them. But when the women arrived in 1728 and stepped off the ship, the men who were watching and eagerly anticipating their arrival whispered to each other how pale and sickly they looked. When the sun touched their skin, it would blister. And each woman brought with her a large casket that allegedly held her belongings. At first, the women were sent to the Ursuline Convent to be taught and cared for by the nuns until they were ready for marriage. The nuns were told that the caskets they had brought with them needed to be stored and not opened until they married, so the nuns placed them on the third floor of the convent, the attic of the building, for safekeeping until that time. But later, when they went to open the boxes, which had been full and heavy when they arrived, the nuns would find out that they were now completely empty. The nuns conferred and realized that the French girls had been traveling with undead companions, and that they had been unwittingly playing host to vampires. At night, the vampires would leave their coffins, exit through the windows of the attic, and prowl the city to feed before returning to the third floor before the sun rose. Proactively, the nuns blessed the convent while the vampires were running free one night. And they sealed the attic windows by nailing them shut with nails that had been blessed by the Pope in Rome. This would prevent the creatures from returning to the safety of their coffins at daybreak. And hopefully, the rising sun would put an end to their evil lives. The legend varies as to whether the girls brought the vampires with them or if they were the vampires themselves. Perhaps their nocturnal activities had been raising eyebrows in France, and they needed to get the heck out of there and find new, unclaimed territory to hunt in. In front of the Ursuline Convent, which granted is pretty creepy at night, our tour guide told us that New Orleans locals will not walk by the building between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. They believe that those original caskets to this day are still locked away in the attic of the convent, behind shuttered windows that are never opened. The general public is welcome to walk through the historical building with a tour, but no one is allowed in that third-floor attic. The only person who has access is the Monsignor, and the 5 windows are never opened, even in the extreme southern heat. During Hurricane Katrina, the gusts of winds reached 174 miles per hour, and one of the shutters blew off the 3rd floor, exposing the dark inside. According to our tour guide, while the city was still being evacuated, they flew someone in from the Vatican to bring new nails, blessed by the Pope, and to oversee the resealing of that window. There's also a story of 2 ghost hunters from the 1970s who hid in the courtyard of the convent one night. They had previously spotted a shutter partially open, and they were hoping to get confirmation that vampires were living in the attic. The next day, their bodies were found, drained of blood. The official story is that the 3rd floor attic holds storage, as the building is now the headquarters of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. Storage, and that is it. But those who believe there's something more to it have investigated themselves, poring over plans of the building to get an idea of how the attic is built. So let's dig deeper and find out if there's any truth to the legend of the Casket Girls and how it became such an important legend to the people of New Orleans. New Orleans was founded by Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, born in Montreal, New France, now Canada, to French colonist parents. Bienville and his brother Iberville went on an expedition to establish a new French colony, Louisiana. In 1699, they explored the Gulf Coast region and founded the French settlement, which is today Mobile, Alabama, but it was once the capital of the Louisiana colony. In 1717, Bienville wrote to France to tell them that he had discovered an area on the Mississippi River, nestled in the Crescent Bend. He thought this area was better than the previously discovered areas because of its location. It would be protected from tidal surges and hurricanes, and it was also located perfectly for trade between the settlements. And having a military presence in that area would allow the French to control the mouth of the Mississippi. He proposed moving the capital from Mobile to this new land, which he called Nouveau Orleans, or New Orleans. There were already occupants living there when Bienville and his brother claimed this land for France. The Chitimacha tribe had been living there for thousands of years. But within 2 years, the town was built up enough for occupants, and Bienville began moving settlers and supplies from the Mobile location to the new capital. In 1721, the 11-by-7 square block rectangular French quarter was designed, located on the highest ground in the city. The early population that settled in New Orleans was a little bit rough around the edges. Soldiers, fur trappers, miners. The French government also sent some of its prison population to the city. This wasn't uncommon in days of colonization. Foreign governments have been using the Americas as dumping grounds for their undesirables for as long as the colonies existed, essentially. In its early days, Australia was a penal colony created for England to send their prisoners. Between 1788 and 1868, 162,000 convicts were sent there from Britain. But before that, England sent its criminals to the American colonies, only starting to send them to Australia on the verge of the Revolutionary War. But like I said, the majority of the people living in New Orleans at this time were men who had needs. Men who had been chasing around the native women to fulfill their needs, and that was causing some tension between the tribes and the colonists. In order to keep the settlers happy and to transform this rough colony into a flourishing city, they needed to do something. They needed to give these men women to keep them busy. But they had to be good women, okay? They had to be like high caliber, good French women who would temper these men and turn them into good husbands and fathers. But who's going to leave their comfortable and established life in France and sail halfway around the world to live in a new place, marry a man they've never met, and settle down in a town that's barely functioning? Well, that was where the French government came in. The Casket Girls were not the first reported incident of women being sent to the colonies for purposes of marriage and childbirth. It had been attempted before. The colony of New France, which today is Quebec in Canada, first started taking in women to stimulate its population growth in 1634. But these girls were not what you would consider marriage material. France had just basically emptied out its prisons and brothels, stuck these women on a boat and said, "Have a nice life." So obviously this first attempt failed, and the colony turned directly to the king to ask for help. They asked him to send better women who would make good wives. These women had to be between the ages of 12 and 25, and they had to carry a letter of recommendation from their home parish. This group of 768 women were called La Fille du Roi, or the King's Daughters. Their passage to the New World was paid for by King Louis. About 737 of these women were married and led to a population increase that directly contributed to the success of that colony. Some were single women, some were orphans, but they'd all been promised a new and better life in the French colony. The next group of women to be sailed over, they went to the Americas. They were called the Pelican Girls. They arrived in Biloxi after Bienville had requested the king to send him some women too. So basically, Bienville had heard about the great success in Montreal and Quebec, and he was like, "Where's my girls? King Louis, where are my girls at?" He wrote to the king, "His Majesty send by that ship girls to be married to the Canadians and others who have begun habitations at Mobile, in order that this colony can firmly establish itself. Each of these girls should be raised in virtue and piety and know how to work, which will render them useful in the colony by showing the Indian girls what they can do. For there's no point in sending other than a virtue known and without reproach." So essentially, he wanted pure women who were untouched by any man or the devil. And these girls were hand-picked. They were between the ages of 14 and 17. But because he had such strict conditions on how these girls could be, he didn't get almost 800 women. He only got 23. And this became an issue, obviously, as there was many men and only 23 women. So the men were fighting over these women. The women were not happy with their new surroundings. The veterans of the colony, the people who'd been living there since its inception, they were used to the really bad food, but the Pelican Girls rebelled against what they were being given to eat and how they were expected to sleep and live. Some of these women who initially lived in Biloxi would eventually migrate to New Orleans. So Bienville hired this man, John Law, and John Law was the epitome of an opportunist. He had created this corporation called the Mississippi Company to create a monopoly within the French colonies of North America and the West Indies. Using his company, Law essentially tried to solve Bienville's problem by kidnapping women off the streets of France. These women were alone. They didn't have anybody who would miss them. They were begging in streets or working in brothels, but most of them had not gone willingly to the Americas. Some of them did volunteer for the trip, but only after being fed a lie that they were headed for someplace better than their current circumstances. They were told that they would lead simple lives, but they would lead happy lives, and they would always have a warm bed and a full belly. And to women who were living on the streets and trying to figure out where their next meal was going to come from, this obviously would be a very attractive offer. But when they arrived in New Orleans, they realized that they'd been misled. They were handed over to men who would go on to abuse them, crammed into small huts with no furnishings. They would swelter in the intense heat, and they never would have enough to eat because there was a shortage of livestock and crops. They arrived already very sick from the long voyage. Some of them were showing signs of venereal disease, some had malnutrition, and a lot of them would die after settling in their new home. In 1721, Bienville wrote to the king again, requested more women because you handled the last group you got so well. He said the men were out of control. They were having affairs with the natives, and we couldn't have that. These men were scoundrels who lived without any rules or law. They needed good women to come in and straighten them out. It's often reported that the king himself found this new group of women, but in fact, he had died in 1715, and it was the Parisian government who decided to honor Bienville's request, even though the year before a royal edict had forbidden any more French prisoners from being shipped to the colonies. Enter the Baleen brides, women found at the Hôpital Général de la Salpêtrière. I know I didn't pronounce it correctly, guys. I tried. I did my best. I'm not a native French speaker. I know I'm going to hear about it in the comments because you guys love to make fun of me for my pronunciation. This institution was built in 1565 by Louis XIV to house 50,000 of Paris's beggars, thieves, and other outcasts. In 1684, a women's prison wing and a remand home for minors was added. Women who were held here endured terrible living conditions and were imprisoned for offenses such as witchcraft, Protestantism, insanity, immoral speech, poisoning, murder, and debauchery. These women, or should I say girls, ranged from ages 12 to 30, and they sailed on the ship La Baleine, and when they arrived in the New World, they were most likely just happy to be out of that horrible institution they'd been kept in, and off of that horrible boat they'd spent months on. Anything would have been better, and some believe that it is among this group of girls that the Casket girls legend was born, but how much of it is true? In fact, these women would not arrive on this ship with large coffin-sized boxes. That's just what we Americans think when we hear the word casket, because to us a casket is synonymous with a coffin. These girls were actually carrying cassettes. Cassettes were small boxes that they would have been able to hold and carry themselves. In this box, they would have placed the things that they were given in order to start their new lives. And when they disembarked after their long journey, they would have looked incredibly pale and sickly, most likely kept below deck with little or no access to sunlight and a limited supply of fresh water and food. Some may have contracted tuberculosis during the voyage, causing them to cough up blood, adding to the vampire legend. But how did the Ursuline nuns get wrapped up into all of this? It doesn't even appear that the Ursuline nuns arrived in New Orleans until after the Casket girls had already been there for several years. They built their first convent in 1734, but it was built on swampland. And in 10 years it was abandoned when the floor started sinking and the walls started shifting due to the soft ground it was built on. The current Ursuline convent on Chartres Street was built in 1745, the one with that third floor attic that the vampires were locked in. The timing certainly doesn't work if we are to believe that the Casket girls who arrived in 1721 would have been holding on to their vampire companions in their tiny huts until the first convent was built in 1734, or the second 10 years after that. Louis XV had requested that some nuns should be sent from France to the New Orleans colony in order to build a convent there and hopefully bring some order to the absolute chaos that existed in the city. There were 12 nuns initially, and they cared for the sick and started a school for the young girls. So the nuns would have arrived in New Orleans after the Casket girls, and they would have built their convent long after these women would most likely have been married off already, but still, it is interesting to speculate and wonder what if. When the Ursuline sisters first arrived in the city, their initial convent wasn't built and wasn't ready for them yet, so they had to live in another house in the city until the convent was ready. During my research for this video, I spoke on the phone to author Marita Wowad Crandall, who wrote the book New Orleans Vampires. She's actually been one of the few people outside of the church who has been allowed into the attic of the Ursuline convent. She wasn't able to publish a lot of what she experienced in her book, but she did talk about it on her website, which is linked in the description box, and she was open to chatting with me about it and answering some questions I had. Her tour guide explained to her that no, the convent attic had never been used for storage. In fact, it had 6 bed chambers up there, and they were built initially for orphans. But when Marita went up into the attic, she found it strange that it seemed empty for the most part, since storage is so scarce in the French Quarter, and here was the most expansive space just left empty. Marita also would discover that aside from these now vacant bedchambers, there was an additional room in the attic. The first room they entered was a normal room, aside from portions of the floor that were missing, portions that, according to Marita, were just the right size for coffins to have been stored there. That final and additional room, though, was the strangest. It was the only one with brick floors, and it seemed darker and smaller than the other rooms. Most eerie of all, there was heavy chains hanging from a beam in the ceiling. Marita also noticed that the door to the room was a Dutch door, which is basically a door that you can open the top half, but the bottom half remains closed. It was the only room in the attic that had such a door, not to mention the only one that had chains hanging in it. When Marita asked her guide what the door's purpose was, she was told it had been installed by the Ursuline sisters so they could stay safe from the room's occupants. I know what you're thinking. Vampires, right? Right? That's what I'm thinking. Vampires? Yeah. However, the guide explained to Marita that there weren't only orphans being held in that attic in its early days. The mentally ill were often housed there as well, and they would be kept in that room, hence the brick floor. See, wood floors would absorb bodily fluids and make it harder to clean, but brick floors could just be sprayed off. The chains were there to restrain them, and the Dutch door made it easy for the nuns to pass over to them food and whatever else it was they needed without actually having to physically go into the room and put themselves in danger from the mentally insane. Marita also told me that her tour guide said that Katrina had done a lot of damage to the attic, and they just didn't have the funds at this time to do the repairs. So it sits mostly empty. They don't put anything in there, really. It's not like it's packed full of storage. But Marita also said that she got this feeling while she was in the attic that there had been something there, but it had been removed before she was invited up. I also chatted with Marita about the time discrepancies between when the Casket girls arrived in New Orleans and when the Ursuline sisters would arrive in New Orleans. Remember when I said that when the nuns first arrived in the city, they didn't have a convent yet, so they had to wait for one to be built. So they had to find other accommodations and a place to live until it was finished being built. But when the convent was ready, they didn't just move quietly from their temporary home to their new one. They threw a parade, essentially, complete with small children dressed like angels. But what was weird about this procession was it really went against the grain of what the Ursuline nuns would usually do. They traveled everywhere in covered carriages. They didn't just walk around in the open and, like on the street like normal people. Everywhere they went, it was in covered carriages, so they weren't really seen a lot. For them to walk in this procession in full view of the public for that long, it was definitely rebellious, it was definitely against the grain, and allegedly this was done to basically signal to the community, God's in town now, and we're his soldiers, and we're going to enforce his rules, so you guys better straighten up. But others speculate that they put on this whole procession to distract people from what was traveling with them. There were many long boxes covered up and being rolled through the streets behind the nuns in this procession. And some believe that these boxes contained the Casket girls or the visitors that the Casket girls had brought with them. They were bringing the caskets with them to the new convent so they could protect the city from the havoc that would certainly be brought down on it if these creatures were allowed to roam at their own disposal and left up to their own devices. And Marita also debunked the story for me about that third floor attic window flying open during Hurricane Katrina and having to have somebody flown in from the Vatican to bless the nails and nail it shut again. That would have really been something, man. She says there's no proof of this, no evidence. It's just a story that's told. And where it's always reported that the Casket girls came to New Orleans, it's often varied about where they came from. Some say the Casket girls were part of the Baleen Brides group and they migrated from Mobile to New Orleans. Others say the women arrived separately and they came right to New Orleans and nobody really knew who sent them or why they were there. But there's one thing I can say for sure. These women, the Casket girls, the Baleen brides, the Pelican girls, what have you, they are considered to be the mothers of New Orleans. And many people who live in the city today are proud to trace their lineage back to these women, these brave, pioneering, and trailblazing women who were basically thrown around as if they were possessions, who were handed over to strange men who were promised a better life but were sold a fake bill of goods. Some of them were kidnapped, some of them were lied to, some of them were abused and beaten. I wouldn't have blamed a single one of them if they wanted to turn into a vampire and take revenge on the entire city. The Ursuline convent and the Ursuline nuns were also extremely important to the development of the city. The women did such good work building schools and helping those in need when they arrived in the city. Some might even say that New Orleans was built on the hard work and sacrifice of these two groups of women. And I know it's hard to think about these times in history when women were treated like property, were treated like a belonging, were treated like basically an inanimate object that could be traded or sold. It's also hard to think about that third floor of the Ursuline convent where the tour guide who spoke to Marita basically told her that the mentally insane would be kept there and locked up and chained to the wall. It's really disturbing to think about the way that we in this country and other countries used to treat the mentally ill. And it makes me so sad to think about these people who are prisoners in their own mind. And they're not given love and attention and understanding or therapy. They're chained to walls and left to sit on a brick floor where they're food's given to them over a Dutch door and they can't even have like any human interaction. It makes me extremely sad. So it's very sad the way that women were treated back in the day. It's very sad the way the mentally ill were treated back in the day. But you know what? The Ursuline nuns, they did what they could. They worked with what they were given. They did what they were taught. So we can't really blame them either. But like I said, I don't think New Orleans would be the city it is today without these two groups of women, badass, strong women who had to make the best of what they were given. I love vampires. I love all things vampires. I loved my vampire tour. Super interesting. Just being in New Orleans, you can literally feel that there are vampires hiding behind shuttered windows. It's amazing. And basically, since I was 14, I've been waiting to meet a vampire so that they can bite me and I can live forever as a vampire. And if there's one out there, I'd really wish that they would come forward sooner than later, because I'm getting older and I don't really want to be turned into an immortal being when I'm like 65. This is a good age. 27 would have been better, but I'll settle for this. And if you ask me now, do vampires exist? I don't know, man, but I sure hope so. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this Harloween video. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you're liking the Harloween content, hit the like button. Comment and let me know what you think about this story. If you haven't subscribed yet and you like what you're seeing, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you can be notified every time I post a video. Stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay spooky, and I'll see you next time. Bye.